Welcome to the third plenary session of the NAFEMS World Congress 2021. I hope you have an enjoyable congress up to now, and we lined up quite a nice collection of presentations for this plenary sessions from various different topic areas. But before we go into that, so I want to remind you, if you want to ask questions, please use the question mark on the top of your screen in the live screen. So this is the third plenary session and the only plenary session for the second day. And we have three presentations, one from a university, one from an end user, and one from a consultancy. And I will introduce the presentations. The first presentation is from G.Boiger. He's a professor of modeling, multiphysics applications, and he's the head of multiphysics modeling and imaging at Zurich University of Applied Sciences. Gernot teaches and develops multiphysics simulations and applied research and development and leads a team of around 20 researchers. He's also European Vice President of the International Society of Multiphysics. Gernot will talk about us today about a unified approach on teaching and modeling 1D dynamic modeling of multiphysical systems. Over to you, Gernot, and to your presentation.
Thank you, Alexander, and I hope you're able to hear me and everything. So, a warm welcome to this talk on a unified approach on teaching and modeling dynamic multiphysics systems. First of all, I'm very honored to be part of NAFEMS World Congress 2021 this year. Thank you for your invitation. I would like to start this off with an introduction about my person, an extension of the introduction that Alexander already gave, and then I will come to the main subject. So, as you already said, Alexander, my name is G.Boiger. I'm a professor of modeling multiphysics applications at the ZHAW, the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, within the ICP, the Institute of Computational Physics at the SOE, the School of Engineering. In that capacity, I'm also head of research area of multiphysics modeling and imaging, and I'm also Vice President Europe of the International Society of Multiphysics. First, a few words about the ZHAW, the Zurich University of Applied Sciences. By now, we are actually the second largest university in Switzerland. We are divided into 8 separate schools/departments all across the canton of Zurich. We are placed in the city of Zurich, in the city of Winterthur, where I'm located right now, and in the town of Wädenswil as well. Our department, the School of Engineering, is probably, historically speaking, the best known and best established of the 8 schools. It was founded as Technikum Winterthur already in the 19th century, and in the 1880s, personalities just like Charles E. Brown, they used to complete their mechanical engineering degree with us. At the beginning of the 20th century, even Albert Einstein gave us the honor of teaching physics within our halls. So you see, this is considerable footsteps to tread in, specifically considering that we have moved more towards applied sciences over the past 120 years. To my institute, the Institute of Computational Physics, there we are a team of 50 engineers, mathematicians, physicists, natural scientists, and over the past 25 years, we have taken great pride in the fact that for an Institute of Applied Sciences, we have done really a lot of research and development. Research and development, applied research and development in the fields of multiphysics modeling in terms of development and application of finite volume and finite element tools, for instance. Development in the fields of fuel cells, organic LEDs, sensor technology, and we also have a strong focus on modeling particle-related flow phenomena. In terms of teaching, we serve a broad basis in terms of teaching basic physics to engineering students. We teach mathematics/numerics and all kinds of engineering sciences, such as hydrodynamics, electrodynamics, and thermodynamics as well. So a really good basis for talking about multiphysics there. Zooming in on my persona a little bit, this is my area of research, the research area multiphysics modeling and imaging. We are, as of today, between 18 and 20 colleagues. And together with the great colleagues Lorenz Holzer and Thomas Hocker, I've basically been building up this research area from scratch over the past 10 years at the Institute of Computational Physics. If one were to sum up what we do on a daily basis in one sentence, it would probably sound like this. We do multiphysics simulation-based product and process development with our Swiss and European-based industrial development partners. Now, coming from this initial introduction to the main focus of my talk, a unified approach on teaching and modeling dynamic multiphysics systems. First, to the basics. And let me first say a few words about what I think are the challenges involved in teaching multiphysics at the University of Applied Sciences. Well, I think that for students of applied sciences, more than for anyone, it is important to grasp the big picture, to see how it all fits together within physics, to see the similarities within the historically separated subfields of physics, rather than to become great specialists in any one of these fields. All right? And this is where our challenge starts. Obviously, the students also need a big competency of application. All right? And in order to get that, they either need a really big RAM, a random access memory, or they need a clever scheme to help them along, to guide them through the jungle of multiphysics. So here is one possible scheme to get there, a scheme that I have been applying for the past 10 years and gradually refining and developing further as well. It all starts and stops with this gentleman, Joshua Willard Gibbs, and obviously his fundamental equation. If you ask me, my favorite equation in all of multiphysics together, because at one glance, this relatively simple equation basically sums it all up and shows the big connectivities between the subfields of physics. On the left-hand side, obviously, the change in global energy for a global system, and on the right-hand side, term after term, energetic contributions of any physical subsystem. And looking at the right-hand side, one sees that all of these terms are composed of products of potentials times some infinitesimal small change of conservative quantity. And that holds true for all engineering relevant fields of physics, such as translational mechanics, rotational mechanics, electrodynamics, hydrodynamics, and the vast and important field of thermodynamics, even extended towards chemical thermodynamics. All right. So at this point, when you present to students with that equation, and that we usually do at the very start, it's a big eye-opener because they see, okay, it cannot all be that hard if everything works similarly, right? It then usually pays off to linger on with Gibbs' equation a bit longer, to inspect it from a different angle maybe. Because one thing sticks out, that within the individual fields of physics, one would see pairs of those right-hand side terms, right? And what are those all about? Well, they're about the basic distinction between those two basic types of systems that we see in nature. Capacitive type systems, which I will then mark in blue, and inductive type systems, which I will further on mark in green. The big original difference between those two types of systems is the kind of conservative quantities they actually store. While capacitive systems store displacement, or something like displacement, general displacement, if you will, the inductive systems store momentum, or quantities related to the inertia principle. So on the capacitive side, we have storage quantities such as actual displacement of a spring, for instance, or angular displacement of a rotational spring, or actually the amount of electric charges stored, for instance, in a capacitor, or fluid volume. So very tangible things on the capacitive system side. On the inductive system side, as I said, it's more about momentum, angular momentum, in electrodynamics, flux linkage, very related concept, and specific momentum in hydrodynamics. Even more specifically, let's go in there in detail, moving to translational mechanics, marking in blue the capacitive systems there. Spring-type systems, all right, we have there. We also use them for analyzing structural mechanics, for instance. For springs, the acting potentials are actually acting forces on those springs. The conservative quantity is the actual displacement. Both quantities three-dimensional, so that's actually three terms. Then we have inductive systems in translational mechanics, moving masses to be more specific. The potential there, interestingly, is the velocity of that moving mass. The conservative storage quantity is the mass's momentum. Moving to rotational mechanics, we have a very analogous situation. We have rotational springs as capacitive systems. We have rotational masses as inductive systems. It becomes even simpler in electrodynamics because there we have our archetype capacitors as capacitive systems. Their potential is the acting voltage on those capacitors, and the storage quantity, who would have guessed, is the amount of electrical charge. Now, on the inductive system side in electrodynamics, we have electrical inductivities, of course. Their potential actually is the electric current. We write it in a capital I and a small q to insinuate what flows. And then the phi EL, that's the conservative quantity there, the electric flux linkage. Not so commonly used in engineering terminology, but an important term in order to get that momentum, that inertia aspect that you would get in coils, for instance, when electric current flows through it and the electric potential goes to zero and the current keeps on flowing through the coils in the same direction. In hydrodynamics then, interestingly, we have also capacitive systems, fluid containers, very simple to imagine. Their potential is pressure. The conservative quantity there is just the fluid volume. Let aside for now the question of whether this is compressible or incompressible. This comes later. And yes, in hydrodynamics, and students sometimes frown upon that, there is also inductivities. They say, what? In hydrodynamic inductivities, what's that? Well, very simple. It's fluid bodies that are in motion. Their potential is associated, or actually is, the volumetric flow rate, IV, and they store specific momentum. To explain what that is, obviously take a big pipe. You have some pressure difference exerted on that pipe that drives the flow in a certain direction, and then let the pressure difference, the potential difference, go to zero, and still, because of inertial effects, the flow will keep on flowing for a certain amount of time. Classic inductive system property. Thermodynamics is interesting because there you see little or actually no green. That means no inductive systems in thermodynamics. Why? Because there we use macroscopic equations to describe masses of microscopic processes. All right? So the word heat wave is an unword because any wave type phenomenon is an abstraction of an interaction of some capacitive and inductive system. And we don't have those in thermodynamics. What we do have is gas volumes acting as capacities. They feature pressure again as potential, and conservative quantity is the gas volume. And then interestingly, heat capacities, their potential is, guess what? The temperature, right? And the conservative quantity is not, as one might shoot out of the hip, thermal energy, but this S here, and that's entropy. You know, thermal energy plays a big role, obviously, but this is on the left-hand side, the Gibbs equation, remember? And then finally and fittingly, we move over to the big field of chemical thermodynamics. And in chemical thermodynamics, we have chemical storage systems. There, the conservative quantity would be Ni, so the amount of molecules stored, chemical molecules, chemical species, and fittingly, the acting potential there is the chemical potential. And it's also known, obviously, as molar Gibbs free energy. Now, after this wild ride, all across engineering relevant fields of physics, students usually require something a bit more tangible. And what better way to get tangible than to go for a graphic interpretation of things? So what we try to do is to try and present the students with a graphic interpretation of physical systems and also for dynamic interactions between those physical systems. We stick with the logic of Gibbs equation, up left there. We say that the left-hand side we call the energy plane. The right-hand side we call the process plane. All right. And on the process plane, what we do is we simply represent each and every physical system as a simple, partially filled container. The container is partially filled with some conservative quantity psi I. Such as any container in real life, also our abstracted container has a cross-sectional area or a capacity called kappa I. That might be constant or it might vary as that container is gradually being filled up. Speaking of filling up the container, we also have a filling height there. That's the phi I. And that is the actual potential of the system. The higher the differences in potentials of two adjacent systems, the stronger the interaction between those systems will be. Then we need one more puzzle piece in order to enable the modeling of dynamic processes, and that's obviously the flows going in and out of these containers. We name them as capital I psi I in order to insinuate, oh, it's a flow of that very conservative quantity. Now, the amount of these flows, as I already said, in many cases depends on the difference of potentials of adjacent systems. What you see up right here is obviously the basic connection between the three variables psi, kappa, and phi. If we partially derive the amount of conservative quantity with respect to the capacity, one would always get the potential of the system. If capacity is constant, we would simply have to divide. And then onto the energy plane. On the energy plane, we would also use the container logic. Just now and there, we have a container filled with energy, right? And we all know that somehow the amount of process quantity on process level, this somehow stores energy, does it? It's in any way related to the amount of energy in that system. And this is how, apart from some fields in thermodynamics, the cross-sectional area of that energy container, the capacity, if you will, can actually be represented by the amount of conservative quantity stored on process side. Interestingly, the filling height, the potential on energy side is the same potential we see on process side. And then, what about the energy flows going in and out of the energy system? They are one-to-one linked to flows on process side. Flows of process quantities always carry energy along with them. And that's how an energy flow can always be computed by multiplying the potential of the actual system times the flow of process quantity. And that's an actual incarnation of the Gibbs equation, right? A change in energy equals potential times change in process quantity. At this point, it usually pays off to move over to applicational examples in order not to get too abstract. But it also pays over to tell students, with this methodology, with this simple methodology, you guys can now model each and every physical system. Put an array of these models into your model, and you will be able to model basically any multiphysics system on a 0D basis and the dynamic interaction between those systems. Now, as I promised, to the application examples. Here is an example that we, if you're lucky, if the class is good, actually do on the very first day of teaching multiphysics. And it doesn't matter whether they are first semester students or young PhD students. Now, check this out. We have 3 vessels. The first one is actually being filled with fluid, with water, if you will. We have 2 more empty vessels. They're all interconnected by hoses. They all share varying cross-sectional areas, right? And it's the student's task now to first create what we call the system dynamic diagram. This is the graphic modeling methodology that I just introduced, basically. And then they will have to plug it in a very simple, graphically programmable numerical solution software, Berkeley Madonna, and temporarily resolve the whole thing without actually doing any maths by themselves, without actually having to write down the differential equations, but just focusing on the physical interaction of things. So here's how that works. This is how the system dynamic model of that situation looks like. Three systems, three hydrodynamic capacities, conservative quantity being the volume, potential of hydrodynamic capacities always being the hydrostatic pressure, and the capacity of these systems being associated to the cross-sectional area, of the actual vessels. The flows between those systems are always modeled according to a resistance law, and there we see the difference in pressure of two adjacent systems, as I said before. Now, 1 week later, or if the students are really good, even in the first week, they can also add the energy plane to all of this, but this is just an additional balance plane that doesn't have anything directly to do with the actual process. So this is how this very model would look in Berkeley Madonna. A very simple graphic interpretation of these things. It usually takes the students 5 to 10 minutes to handle Berkeley Madonna. That's how simple it is. And it takes another 5 to 10 minutes to set up a model just like that. And then pushing a button and setting certain boundary conditions, Berkeley Madonna does all the maths and the numerics. It transfers this graphical interpretation of things into a series of first-order ordinary differential equations. And it uses, for instance, a 4-step multidimensional Runge-Kutta scheme to resolve. And thus, after about an hour of work maximum, the students are able to retrieve a graph like this. A graph, for instance, that shows the filling height of those three vessels printed out against time as the filling heights and the potentials of those three systems level out. Now, the students are then able to play around a bit, to modify system properties, capacities, stuff like that, boundary conditions, and we are able to give them a first feeling of success, a feeling of empowerment to be able to actually do something within that vast field of multiphysics. And as we all know, a feeling of success is the first thing you need in order to incite fascination. And fascination we will need a lot later on as the teaching proceeds. Then we go on a bit more in detail concerning the theory, and we split up the system theory a bit into representation of capacitive and inductive systems. All right, I've said that before. Now, at first sight, the representation is extremely equivalent on both sides. The only thing that's basically different is the type of storage quantities we see here. As I said before, on capacitive side, it's going to be general displacement. On inductive side, it's going to be general momentum. One more thing is interesting. You see those potentials here on capacitive side? If we're talking about related systems within the same field of physics, then we will find those potentials as flow variables on the inductive side. And the other way around. We will find the potentials on inductive side as flow variables on the capacitive side. Let me illustrate, as I would illustrate to students, with an example. The archetype example of a capacitive and an inductive system switched together is an oscillating cycle. And in mechanics, yes, this is two springs and a mass. So in this case, we model those two springs here as two capacitors. One stores displacement x1, the other one displacement x2. They are connected by ix, and that's actually the velocity of motion. They have potentials, forces 1 and forces 2. The cross-sectional area is connected to the spring constants in that sense. And in the very center of that model stands the mass. It serves as inductivity in that sense. Cross-sectional area being the inductivity of the system, that's the actual mass in kilos. It stores momentum in Newton seconds. Its potential is now the velocity. Down here, it was the flow. And the flow in and out of that inductivity is actually related to forces, which served as potentials for both springs. Now, the really interesting part for the students usually comes when we now start switching between the individual fields of physics. We now switch from from mechanics to electrodynamics. An oscillating cycle composed of capacitor, inductivity, resistor, and you see the nature of the model has not changed at all. All dynamic interactions stay the same, all system logic stays the same, it's just the names of the variable that varies. And then we make another jump towards hydrodynamics. The system model stays exactly the same, just now in hydrodynamics, we suddenly have a U-tube that is filled with fluid that wobbles back and forth, until the wobbling dies down because of hydraulic laws. And at that point, let me conclude the 0D view of things, and let me give you an outlook of how we try to set off the students in the direction of three-dimensional analysis in relation to transport equations. It's actually quite simple based on the model that we have introduced. We still start again with our balance region, with our conservative quantity psi. Just now, we tell the students we focus more on the flow aspect of things and on the phenomena that can incur flows of process quantity in and out of those containers. Phenomena like convection that can flow in and flow out of a balance region. Phenomena like diffusion that can flow in and out of a balance region. Gamma, in this case, being the general diffusion coefficient. Phenomena like source or sink terms that would happen within the volume, but still are represented as flows in that scheme. What remains to be done now is to shrink the balance region, to get smaller and smaller until it becomes infinitesimally small, so that the extended conservative quantity becomes a volume-specific variable of analysis. And thus we actually already arrive at the general differential balance equation, where the finite differences, for instance for the convection terms, have now become divergences, where the finite differences, for instance for the diffusion term, have become a divergence using the Nabla operator 2, and then in the end we add the general source term. Now, almost coming to an end. At this point, we can very simply and very easily replace those general variables in that general balance equation step by step, and that's all it takes, logically, to jump between the individual fields of physics, because the basic laws as we have them introduced, them same everywhere. And we've proved that to the students at that point. So if we just exchange that phi, then we can do a mass balance if that phi becomes rho local density, measured in kilos per cubic meter. If we want to do an energy balance, the phi becomes a small h, the local specific enthalpy measured in joules per cubic meter. If we want to do a chemical species balance, it's the local concentration Ci of species I measured in moles I per cubic meter. And interestingly, for the three momentum balance, you see moving towards Navier-Stokes here, we obviously have three different variables. They are measured in momentum unit, Newton seconds per cubic meter. They are density times respective flow velocity. And then finally, the diffusion coefficient for mass balances, it becomes 0, because obviously no diffusion in mass balance. And then for all the other fields, we have the classical diffusion coefficient, the classical unit being square meters per second. And then the units, the students frown one more time and say stuff like, I had not realized that kinematic viscosity in square meters per second is actually a diffusion coefficient. And well, in a way it absolutely is, because it tells you how well the quantity of momentum is being conducted perpendicular to the main flow direction. And then we just have to add the source term with the correct units, and we are there. So let me conclude this talk giving you a final overview of what I just presented. I started off with Gibbs fundamental equations. I made the distinction between representing capacitive and inductive systems in nature. I gave you the graphic interpretation that we try to convey to the students that really helps them along to understand it all and how it's all connected. I gave some applicational examples and finally came to how we move into 3 dimensions and the transport equations. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm obviously open for questions.